Good afternoon. During this past year, I have been working with many couples who have wanted to improve their marital relationship. I have used both some of the common, well-known therapies, but I have also relied upon the Bahá'í writings, although because of restrictions in my job, I have not been able to identify them as Bahá'í writings. And I'm happy to report that they do work. It is as a result of this experience that the idea for this paper emerged. But in writing this paper, it was necessary to make a coherent presentation. I wonder if Peter is here. I don't know whether it will meet his requirements that he set forth this morning. But we wanted to go from the philosophical to the practical. And because of Helgi's interest in the subject and his study in philosophy, we have combined to do this and present this paper today. We'll be dealing with it in three parts. The first will be the ideal of marriage. The second will be the remedies offered by some of the social scientists for healing relationships. The third will be the Bahá'í approach to healing marital relationships. Helgi will now present the first portion of the paper.
Yeah, this is the philosophy and the idea behind the marriage. I'm certainly not an expert on the subject. On the practical aspects, many people look at me kind of funny when I'm doing a paper on marriage. Sure. Okay. If I'm going to read excerpts, I'll try and talk as much, but we'll read a good portion of it. If one is to heed the writings of philosophers like Plato and religious prophets, specifically Baha'u'llah, marriage will be seen as an integral and indispensable aspect of man's struggle towards his ideal or potential. Plato defines the purpose of man as life in contemplation of absolute beauty. This absolute beauty is the unity discernible to enlightened individuals in the particular world, in the finite, mortal world. It is the cohesive force, the creative principle that combats entropy in this world of infinite particles and different forces and entities. The beauty is when this comes together in a creative expression, anything that joins together. Beauty is apparent in art, Plato tells us, only when art reflects metaphorically the harmony and ultimate unity in the universe. The contemplation of this beauty as it appears in reality, and the love of this contemplation by man, is what gives purpose to and explains man. Baha'u'llah confirms this definition of man's purpose in a short obligatory prayer. You're created to know me and to worship, know God and worship God. God being the creative principle, the absolute, the blessed beauty, all terms we find in the writings, that transcends the universe man perceives. This principle goes beyond what we can perceive. We cannot get our minds around an infinite, the concept of an infinite. This goes beyond, and the finite world simply mirrors this. This is a universe which is merely a particular and finite reflection of the infinite God. And so Plato, like Baha'u'llah, or rather vice versa in a historical perspective, defines man's purpose as the pursuit of unity and harmony in this particular and finite world. As particular in the sense as opposed to the holistic. You look at something holistically, or you look at it as a particular, at particulars. So I've looked at marriage in this context and have drawn three purposes for the sake of the argument, and they're on the board here. The first purpose is marriage as it joins together two separate entities, and as such demonstrates or practices the creative unifying principle of the universe, called God, or alternatively the absolute beauty. The second purpose is marriage as joining two people with the same aspirations enables a greater scope of resources, and thereby the ability to realize better the life in contemplation of the absolute beauty. And thirdly, marriage establishes the creative and healthy environment whereby mortal men can propagate and ensure their physical well-being and spiritual immortality. Somewhat different than what's written there, but this is the better version, and you'll find out now. I'm going to go over the three principles in short. Marriage demonstrates, or rather becomes a very part of, the principle of unity by the sheer reality of unifying two separate and individual entities. The two people become more than forces acting in sympathy. They merge into a common force acting towards a single goal, that of the life in contemplation of absolute beauty, the life dedicated to the knowledge and worship of God. As Abdu'l Baha states it then, quote, from the pairing of even the smallest particles in the world of being are the grace and bounty of God made manifest, and the higher the degree, the more momentous the union. Above all other unions is that between human beings. Thus is the primal oneness made to appear. Now, as such, we see marriage as the basis for all social existence. And it struck me as I was listening to David Smith's talk yesterday particularly, but I've noticed the theme running out, the idea of man's social identity. Man outside of a society is really a mere animal, and everything that man has is owed to the social environment and the social contributions he makes. He works to develop the social aspect, which in turn affects him. And this is the quote that he read, David Smith read yesterday from Ruhia Kanum. And another very interesting part of this concept between the joining together of two separate entities is you find throughout mythology the male-female principle you find in yin and yang, in the Oriental philosophy. The great original of the Chinese chronicles, the holy woman Tai Yan, was the embodiment of both the masculine yin and the masculine yang, and the feminine yin. Eros and Hermaphrodite of the Greek mythology were also androgynous, both male and female. And Teresa, the blind seer that you find in the Oedipus myth and other myths, is also both male and female, and he or she is able to do many immortal things, particularly see the future. Shiva, the Hindu god, is united. This is a quote from Campbell in Hero of a Thousand Faces. United in a single body with Shakti, his spouse, the right side, he the right side, she the left side, in the manifestation known as the half-woman Lord. An unpronounceable Hindu name. The Judeo-Christian myth of Adam and Eve is really the most interesting for me, because this is where the West derives its this whole culture. The first man was androgynous, and this again from Campbell, the removal of the feminine form into another form symbolized the beginning of the fall from perfection into duality. You thought it was eating the apple, right? The apple came after they were separated into two distinct and particular beings. Since this original splitting, man has struggled in a world of multiplicity, aspiring toward the understanding and realization of that oneness, harmony, Tao, nirvana, depending on the culture. When man is can transcend the finite reality of paired opposites. He can go beyond the fact that things are a contradiction and then there's paradoxes, and he goes to that essential unity. The Baha'i faith, you can find this in Baha'i Revelation by Tahirzadeh. He states that, quote, all created things, whether tangible or intangible, come into being as a result of the intercourse between two elements which assume the functions of male and female. This pattern is followed throughout the whole of creation. Okay, that's unquote. Seen in this light, then, marriage is of essential importance to man's attainment of the absolute knowledge or the knowledge of God. Marriage is the practical demonstration of the principle of unity. And by partaking of that principle of unity, we partake of that absolute beauty, that creative force, and we can derive the benefits thereof. And that's the demonstration of the principle of unity, male-female principle. The second point, then, is really a continuation of the first. The two entities, once they're so intimately united towards this one goal, they assume powers and abilities that transcend the mere addition of the two individual powers. It's a synergistic combination of man's ability to perceive the unity in the universe. This is partly because of the nature of man's cognitive insight, the way he understands things, and partly and more mysteriously because of the fact that by partaking of and adding to the creative principle of the universe, man is party to and beneficiary of the positive and creative workings of the universe. We find that at the beginning of the Green Prayer Book. It says, though he may at first remain unaware of its effects, yet the virtue of grace vouchsafed unto him must need sooner or later exercise its influence upon his soul. All right, the mystery of this synergistic combination is great, and perhaps the secret behind Abdu'l-Baha's title, or Baha'u'llah's, of the Supreme Talisman, man as the Supreme Talisman. And this one identifiable mechanism is the experience of joy. Marriage as a vehicle to experience the joy which Abdu'l-Baha talks about in the reality of man, as in times of joy our strength is more vital, our intellect keener, and our understanding less clouded. And while joy is experienced outside of marriage, granted in a community, the bond in a marriage is where man can best develop that spiritual union where he has the greater ability to experience joy. Joy is a measure of the successful marriage. It is a marriage is successful in enabling the partners to partake of and further understand the absolute beauty. And joy, lasting and uplifting, will be the effect upon the partners. According to Abdu'l-Baha, joy is the sign of spiritual and physical well-being, and therefore the indication of the noble and virtuous life, which is, I forgot to mention earlier, Plato, of course, is the great advocator of the noble and the virtuous life, as you find out through the writings on the virtuous life. As the function of marriage is the promotion of immortality. All right, this is the idea of propagating ourselves. Plato states, in a very interesting quote, I'm so always struck by the similarities between Plato and Baha'u'llah. Music could always help. The object which they, men, have in view is birth in beauty, whether in body or soul. This is procreation, which must be in beauty and not deformity. And this procreation is the union of man and woman, and is a divine thing. For the conception and generation are an immortal principle in a mortal creature. And that's what we've put down there. And that is, while marriage is at one time the dramatization of man's love for beauty, in the Platonic sense, or love for God, it is also the only way for him to constructively procreate himself, both physically and spiritually. That is, when in an animal existence you have physical propagation, and in a marriage where you can reflect this joy and these attributes of God, it's the spiritual procreation of men, and there we get our spiritual and physical immortality. And we by being immortal, we partake again of that original principle of oneness and unity. And marriage then is the practical result of man's love for the ideal, a love that is the cohesive force of the universe. And it's from Elder Bahá'í. Okay, to view marriage as a vehicle to immortality, an institution of so great a potential and occasioning for joy, would also be to view divorce as unthinkable. If marriage is a means to overcome man's immortal bounds, it would almost seem paradoxical that such a thing could be given up for the sake of mortal and human conflicts of interest and disagreements. And this is, in essence, what's gleaned from the Baha'i writings about divorce. And my mother will now read 3 or 4 quotes from a recently released document discussed in a letter from the Universal House of Justice, stating the Baha'i position on divorce.
Divorce should be avoided most strictly by the believers, and only rare and urgent circumstances be resorted to. Modern society is criminally lax as to the sacred nature of marriage, and the Baha'is must combat this trend assiduously. Another quote, "For the Baha'i teachings, consider divorce a reprehensible act which should be resorted to only in exceptional circumstances and when grave issues are involved, transcending such considerations as physical attraction and sexual compatibility and harmony." Another quote, "As Baha'u'llah was so very much against divorce, even though he permitted it, and considered marriage a most sacred responsibility, believers should do everything in their power to preserve the marriage they have contracted and to make of them exemplary union governed by the noblest motives." Another quote, "The Baha'is must, through rigid adherence to the Baha'i laws and teachings, combat these corrosive forces which are so rapidly destroying home life and the beauty of family relationships and tearing down the moral structure of society."
Okay, it's no great insight to observe that marriage in contemporary society is no longer fulfilling the goals and purposes that it should, and its very validity is now being questioned. With the legitimate legalization and support for the common law marriage and the soon-to-be passed no-fault divorce, society, secular society, no longer has the condemnation that it did, and we now have social legitimacy for any kind of cohabitation. And it is not our purpose, though, here to show that this is the case, or even to discuss the social ramifications of this, although that would be interesting. But what is here intended is an examination of the solutions put forward by secular scientists, and whether these solutions are in keeping with the essence and the purpose of marriage as described by Plato and Baha'u'llah. And now we'll go into a discussion on the secular social scientists' solutions to marriage.
I'd like to cover just a few of the remedies that I have put in my paper because time doesn't permit us to go into all of them. But many of the prescriptions for a healthy marital relationship fall into two categories: improving communication or improving sexual techniques. Carl Rogers and Sherrod Miller, although of vastly different styles, both look to bettering the communication between the partners as the key to solving marital problems. Rogers emphasizes commitment, communication, male and female role clarification, and mutual personal growth. He thinks that if these are present in any marital relationship, any sexual difficulties can be resolved. Virginia Satir takes an approach that would immediately endear her to a disciple of Plato or Baha'u'llah. Her main point is that problems within marriage must be solved by therapy directed towards the family as a whole rather than the individuals therein. This recognizes the social relationship and social environment and concludes that perverse individuals are really only the manifestations of perverse social relationships, namely marriage relationship. Her family therapy has involved the use of group games where the members of a family can involve themselves in mock situations that are close enough to reality that significant conclusions can be reached. Sex therapy is another method advocated to heal a troubled marriage. At the forefront of this field, if for no other reason than being the most prolific, is Albert Ellis, who, despite the fact that he himself has been married 6 times and has written over 30 books and monograms on sexual aspects and solutions to troubled relationships. His views include that many couples are victims of their own idealistic but unrealistic views. They have been conditioned to believe that marriage is a sacred covenant in which the element of freedom of expression, particularly in their sexual relations, has no place. And he considers this harmful. He contends that sex should be indulged in whenever the urge is present, that it should be joyous, exciting, and pleasurable. It is inconceivable to him that nature should have provided us this supreme pleasure for the sole purpose of raising a family. He sees no reason for guilt and shame when experimenting with any and all kinds of sex techniques and behaviors. And even goes so far as to say if you have any shame or guilt, he advises pondering your past to eliminate such prejudices that would prevent you from becoming involved. A further and more dangerous and defeating aspect of Ellis's theory is its encouragement to forget the oughts and the shoulds and live for the moment as best as one can. The other theory or principle is the idea of open marriage. You've heard probably of the book written by Nina and George O'Neill. At a conference recently, I heard announced that they have just recently written a book which is an apology for the first book on open marriage because they found that it didn't work.
Well, these authors and all of the authors that we dealt with mentioned and stated either explicitly or implicitly that marriage is not permanent, and in fact, if it is thought of as so, the relationship is in jeopardy. We get hung up in the oughts and shoulds. This is in contrast to what is found in the Baha'i faith. And Abdu'l-Baha states, quote, "Know that the command of marriage is eternal. It will never be changed or altered. So what's going on here? The difference is due to the importance placed on the physical aspects of marriage by the marriage counselors. Communication skills, intellectual prowess, sexual virility, and emotional fervor are all fickle things. And to base a marriage on them, the emphasis, marriage is placed in the realm of the eternal, and is the principle that transcends the physical world and achieves that principle of unity. In fact, the principle oneness striven for in the Bahá'í marriage often involve concepts that are contradictory and paradoxical to the physical world. The androgynous man, the concept of infinity, and the unsatiated appetite, for example. Consequently, it can now be seen as impossible to reach the ideal of marriage through the physical reality of man. Rather, this lesser reality must be overcome or circumvented, and then working back from the ideal, then you arrange the particular and the finite aspects of your marriage, the human part of it, according to that basic unity. And we find this in Plato as well, in the Symposium, where he's describing Socrates. Socrates for Plato was the embodiment of the ideal man, the ideal lover of knowledge and beauty. And we find in the introduction to the Symposium is this: we are not to suppose that he is tempted, Socrates, but that he sets aside a seducer's charm as being of less value than the moral and intellectual beauty after which he is striving. And in this he shows himself the noblest kind of lover, who has passed beyond the law of physical beauty. Socrates, you know, is really ugly. And though he is still aware of its attractions. And this is the ideal of love, then, where love is the ultimate and ultimately spiritual, but acknowledges the physical reality of marriage, but keeps it definitely secondary to that primal and eternal unity. Okay, now the practical remedy to a troubled marriage, then, if you look at it this way, is really quite simple. We don't shoot around and try and rectify the infinity of small problems we might encounter because of communication. We don't relate to our wife or husband, or we don't sexually fulfill them. No, what we do, because these problems can go on, and what we want is to go to the heart of that of the relationship, that is your spiritual sameness that all men have, and that common aspiration towards the absolute beauty. Once that's set in line, the rest can be easily adjusted. And this is the problem with the social scientist, who would call this sort of a solution impossibly idealistic. It is beyond him only because he is attacking the problem from the wrong end, trying to arrange the infinity of finite particulars into a relationship towards a harmonious coexistence, instead of working backwards from the point of harmony and unity. And this is where we get into the idea, the role of consultation in Bahá'í marriages. Consultation is set to, looking at it from a philosophical point of view, it is a way of combining the three aspects of man: the intellectual, the emotional, and the physical, and the different ramifications in an intercourse between the two people. That, because it is balanced, a balanced combination of the three aspects, man is able to go beyond them. One cannot dominate the other, and the three in harmony will afford the most perfect possible communication between the two. And now Mother will finish off talking about the particulars of Bahá'í consultation.
To give you one quote about the Bahá'í view of marriage, it is a quote from Shoghi Effendi to an individual believer. He would urge you to endeavor by every means in your power to compose your differences and not to allow them to reach such proportions as to lead to your complete and final separation from your husband. For while, according to Baha'i law, divorce is permissible, yet it is highly discouraged and should be resorted to only when every effort to prevent it has proved to be vain and ineffective. It is for you to ponder carefully over the spiritual implications which any act of divorce on either part would involve, and strengthened by the power of faith and confident in the blessings which strict adherence to the principles and laws of Baha'u'llah is bound to confer upon every one of his faithful followers, to make a fresh resolve to solve your common difficulties and to resort to harmony, peace, and happiness of your family life. So that is the direction that we are to aim. The laws of Baha'i marriage serve to enforce this harmony in the everyday world. It's not my purpose here to define consultation, but let it suffice to say that the ideal consultation forges a balance between intellectual inputs and the emotional, intuitive inputs on a pivot of identification with a common purpose. Baha'u'llah stressed the importance of consultation, and the Universal House of Justice, in a letter again to the Baha'i world, said we should not think this worthwhile method of seeking solutions is confined to the administrative institutions. Family consultation employing full and frank discussion and animated by the awareness of the need for moderation and balance can be the panacea for domestic conflict. With regard to the present condition, the impression I have been left with as a result of preparing for this paper, and with the very high divorce rate among Baha'is, I am convinced that as individuals and as institutions, we have concerned ourselves with the administrative requirements and not the spiritual requirements of Baha'i marriage.